finished reading and studying Act 2, but you want to have a better idea about how this interesting act comes across in different productions. Well, I'm going to whiz you through 4 different productions: 1979, the BBC version; 2004, which is the one recorded live at the Globe; 2006, a modern version, quite interesting; 2019, RSC. I'm going to give you screenshots from each of those productions, analyse them, and show you how you might include them within an essay. Stay tuned, you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare.
Let's start with Desmond Davis's 1979 production of Measure for Measure for the BBC. Here in the heat and battle of Act 2, Scene 2, Isabella is arguing about the privileges of authority and pointing out that great men, such as Angelo, can get away with things that ordinary men, such as Claudio, cannot. The great can jest with saints, can make jokes about holy people, and can be seen as funny and clever. However, those of a more ordinary class making the same jokes would be seen as disrespectful and sacrilegious. Similarly, a captain in an army can say something rash and be seen as angry, whereas a soldier would be condemned far more harshly for the same thing. The point Isabella is making is that there is no single scale of judgment, and implicitly that Angelo is wrong to think that because he is able to control himself and follow these archaic rules, then everyone else should be able to do the same. And if they are not, they should all be punished in the same way. Isabella is passionately and persuasively using examples in an attempt to prompt Angelo to be more flexible and compassionate in his application of the law. And in the 1979 production, these words are clearly having some effect. Tears can be seen on Angelo's bamboozled face as he asks, bewildered, why Isabella is thrusting these sayings about the privileges of authority upon him. These tears confirm initial impressions of Angelo as essentially a principled man, someone who believes in upholding the law, even if he also takes a little too much pleasure in his gravity and his reputation, as confirmed in his soliloquy at the beginning of Act 2, Scene 4. And this impression of Angelo as fundamentally a good, principled, upstanding man is confirmed in this production with the utter outrage and fury with which he initially challenges Isabella's suggestion that he could be bribed. Of course, Isabella means that she is prepared to offer Angelo prayers to God for him in exchange for Claudio's life. But an utterly worked up Angelo interprets this admittedly unwittingly provocative verb as meaning that she might be prepared to offer up her body. Angelo cannot believe what he thinks he is hearing. He has not yet had time to fully comprehend his own feelings and emotions, and so is defaulting to his currently being destabilized identity as someone incorruptible, unblemished, unimpeachable. On to Act 2, Scene 4, and in these musing, angst-filled words, Angelo is pondering how human beings, both idiots and the supposedly more intelligent, can be too easily impressed and swayed by appearance and clothing. Just because someone looks respectable and honourable does not mean that they are not harbouring darker, dishonourable feelings and desires. Something he knows all too well as he ponders the advent of his own sexual desires and the arrival of his own throbbing, all too hard blood. In this production, the use of the mirror works well. We can see the two Angelos, the one everyone in Vienna knows well, the man of stricture and firm abstinence, the other, the darker, shadier, lurking, more inscrutable. In addition, the mirror serves as a visual means for Angelo to examine himself and consider who he is and who he is becoming following the awakening of his own dormant sexual desires. Clearly, Act 2, Scene 4 is a particularly dramatic scene, and directors need to decide how forcefully Angelo behaves on stage. In this production, Angelo moves towards kissing Isabella, who moves back quickly, shocked. Here, this movement helps illustrate his intent, that he does mean exactly what he is saying, that his words most certainly express his purpose. Similarly here, we have a physical demonstration of Angelo's newfound determination to give his sensual race the rein, to allow himself to be driven by his passions. So in this production, he physically grabs Isabella, not with the idea that he is going to act upon his urges there and then, but to show her his resolve and iron willpower. He will have his way with her, or her brother will die. Irrespective of her supposed time-wasting modesty and desire for her not to lead him on. Time for one of my sample paragraphs, this time on the question as to whether this is a play in which power is invariably misused. I reference this 1979 BBC production. Measure for Measure is a play which ostensibly ends happily, with wrongs righted and newly married couples ready to embark upon their lives together. Who would argue against the Duke using his power to bring Mariana and Angelo back together, which is what the former, rather inexplicably to the audience, wants more than anything else? Or even that Barnardine, having spent 9 years in prison without knowing when his execution will actually take place, deserves his release and fresh start. The Duke's marriage proposal to Isabella is more contentious, and I will explore this later on in this essay. However, some productions do paint this as a wonderful, happy opportunity for Isabella. There is cheering, for instance, in the 1979 BBC production, rather than an abuse of power per se. However, in Act 2, it is clear that Angelo aims to abuse his power and position and emotionally blackmail Isabella into giving up her body to such sweet uncleanness, i.e. to him. He feels that he is able to get away with such abuse of power because previously he has had an unsoiled name and that everyone has witnessed the austereness of his life. In the 1979 BBC production, Angelo tries to kiss Isabella to illustrate that his words indeed express his purpose, and he also physically manhandles her in order to show his determination to give his sensual race the rein. Further abuses of his position of authority towards someone who wants to become a nun. However, Angelo may try to abuse his power and position, but ultimately he is thwarted by someone who holds more power than him, in theory a benign, caring duke. Next, onto the 2004 production filmed at the Globe and broadcast live on BBC 4. I find Juliet's attitude quite interesting in this production. Stereotypically, you might expect the character playing Juliet to have her head lowered, speaking in a soft, repentant voice. None of that here. Within the moment on screen, in this production, Juliet interrupts the rambling friar and simply seems to be saying that she repents, as it is an evil, to shut up the witterer. Her words may indicate repentance, but her confident, strident voice backs up the idea that she is happy, she is joyful to be pregnant. This pregnancy for her is nothing to be ashamed of, but to be celebrated and declared from the rooftops, even to supposed men of God. Juliet's confident fluency contrasts with the faltering, waffly-sounding delivery of the friar in this production. Dove alters Shakespeare's original so that the confident Juliet interrupts the Duke once again, making him seem all the more ineffectual, inconsequential and weak. The original version is shown on screen now, but at the Globe the lines were integrated far more closely, with Juliet unable to stop herself interjecting the very second she has heard the ludicrous statement that Claudio is going to die the next day. This is a less passive, unashamed, passionate Juliet, whilst this Duke seems shambling. Could this be part of his disguise? Possibly, but nonetheless he cuts a rather ludicrous figure in this production and in this scene, someone clearly incapable of providing the comfort or authority that, in theory, a friar should. Meanwhile, in Act 2, Scene 4, the Angelo of this production actually fondles Isabella, as you can see from the screenshot. This ups the ante. Angelo becomes guilty not just of abusive position blackmail, but sexual assault. Something which continues when he attempts to snog Isabella, in spite of her frantic cries of, "Oh no!" All in all, the episode lasts around 5 seconds. In this production, Angelo loses control completely, albeit momentarily, genuinely gives his central race the rein. He is ravaged by his own internal sexual desires. Seemingly a novice in this area, he becomes a sexual predator and surpasses Claudio's so-called sin due to the total lack of mutuality. So, is the Duke fantastical and of dark corners? The suggestion that the Duke is fantastical would seem to indicate that he is someone who comes up with extravagantly fanciful plans and ideas. However, on many levels this claim does not stand up to close scrutiny. Firstly, Vienna is in a mess, and who better than someone with snow broth blood and, at least in theory, firm abstinence to ensure those who commit crimes are punished? Secondly, Angelo's indecent proposal to Isabel could not have been predicted, is emphatically not of his making, and requires a degree of thought and cunning to resolve. Yes, the plan to substitute Isabella with Mariana is extravagant, but it ensures Isabella's honour remains untainted and Mariana is advantaged. Fantastical seems to suggest that the Duke is absurdly otherworldly, someone from a fantasy world. But in this plan, he devises a completely practical plan which will allow him to find out more about his deputy, something helpful in establishing future roles within Vienna's governance. That said, he can often come across as devious and indeed fantastical on stage, notably within the 2004 production at the Globe. As well as emerging from a laundry basket at the beginning of Act 1, Scene 3, in Act 2, Scene 3, his speech is laughably faltering and stumbling when in conversation with a surprisingly loud-voiced Juliet. Indeed, in this production, the Duke's final speech of the act is interrupted and taken over by the indignant pregnant woman cutting in to cry in disbelief, "Must die tomorrow." This lack of calm, decisive authority, even as a friar, makes him seem, and apologies in advance for the colloquialism, rather dodgy, someone who may well be needing to take advantage of dark corners in order to achieve his goals. Next, 2006 Bob Komar version of the play. And it's important to reference a change to the sequence of scenes within this production. The first part of Act 2, Scene 1, in which Angelo gives his views on the importance of the law being upheld consistently and firmly to Aeschylus, appears immediately after the end of Act 1, Scene 1. In the original, of course, we move from the Duke's transfer of power in Act 1, Scene 1 to Act 1, Scene 2, in which Lucio and two other gentlemen speculate about the Duke and joke amongst each other before the respective entries of Mistress Overdone, Pompey, and Claudio himself. Thus, the mood is far more light-hearted, and the spotlight is not on Angelo to anywhere near the same extent. Indeed, the first time he is indirectly mentioned in Act 1, Scene 2 is in line 57, with the revelation that Claudio has been arrested and carried to prison. So, in this Komar production, the spotlight beams on Angelo earlier, and he comes across as even more dogmatic and unyieldingly dictatorial in this version of Act 2, Scene 1, partly due to Aeschylus's lines being cut. You can see how this scene has been butchered, with Aeschylus' scripts of all, in this production, her lines, including her plea for Angelo to take a more moderate approach. Additionally, the director chooses to use a voiceover at certain points and shows Angelo's crackdown taking place. Here we can see Juliet being unceremoniously and brutally seized, and Claudio here. And whilst we remember the chaos and carnage of the early part of the film, which included cocaine sniffing, sexual activity within toilets and flag burning, the savage way Claudio and Juliet are arrested does seem over the top and harsh, especially given the fact that the Duke himself equally partook in such activities. Angelo seems rather too pompous and self-righteous for our liking, as the camera pans between distressing images of heavy handling and oh so calm smugness. This aloof-seeming arrogance continues when Isabella first arrives to speak to him. He fails to offer her the simple courtesy of turning around or looking at her whilst asking what is her will. And he is still not turned to face her when he challenges the admittedly ludicrously illogical suggestion that he might condemn the fault and not the actor of it. So what should we make of this behaviour, this failure to follow basic rules of courtesy or social behaviour? Might this Angelo be on the autistic spectrum and struggle with basic eye contact, the rules of social communication? Or might he be someone who has had, Mariana accepted, very little contact with women and so find direct dealings with them uncomfortable? Or might he understand in his darkest, deepest soul just how tempting and attractive women can be, resulting in him choosing to limit his dealings with them to the bare minimum? In my mind, this persistent looking away from Isabella works well and hints at repressed feelings and emotions which will come to the surface following sustained dealings with this fair maid. As indeed happens in Act 2, Scene 4, when he is so outraged at Isabella's cheek in suggesting that she will tell the world aloud what man thou art, that he pins her down on his desk and holds her there by the wrists. His grip tightens as the speech goes on, with the spread legs position of Isabella having obvious violent sexual overtones. What we're seeing clearly in this production is that Angelo the man is significantly stronger than Isabella. Not only is she disadvantaged by the power imbalance, but also by the fact that Angelo may be prepared to overpower her physically in order to satisfy his uncontrollable desires and urges. So, to what extent do we feel that the women in the play are dominated by the men? Isabella's two exchanges with Angelo in Act 2 are significant in relation to the question as to whether the women in the play are dominated by the men. It is true that she takes a while to warm to her task and needs some prompting from Jack-in-the-Box Lucio in the original text, although not in Kumar's 2006 production, in which Lucio's character barely features, and she herself takes the decision to try Angelo again. However, once she gets into her stride, the way she dominates the exchange and comes up with passionate, compelling reasons for Angelo to save her brother's life is impressive. Ultimately, Angelo cannot cope with her verbal bombardment and her persistent use of rhetorical devices, including dizzying use of anaphora early on in Act 2, Scene 2, for which I would not plead, for which I must not plead. Perspective challenging anti-metaboly, if he had been as you and you as he, and broad-ranging imagery, which includes references to figures as diverse as an ape, Jove, and new-made man. Unfortunately, this ability to dazzle verbally is of comparatively little worth in a society in which the Duke or his chosen deputy seems to have ultimate power if he chooses to use it. Furthermore, a number of productions show men choosing to capitalize on superior physical strength as well as institutionalized power in order to intimidate and dominate women. For instance, in Kumar's 2006 production, Isabella's fabulous oratory ultimately results in Angelo pinning her to his desk, clearly sexually aroused and furious at her non-compliance. Now, the RSC 2019 production of the play. I think the comic scenes are important in the play, and that versions which choose to cut them, such as the 2006 Komar film, lose something important and run the danger of becoming too intense. In the RSC 2019 production, as well as the obvious laughs from Elbow's silly malapropisms, the director is keen to paint Froth as a similarly ridiculous caricature. Here you can see him attempting a forward roll when referred to, which goes horribly wrong. And when he does speak more than a phrase, it is clear from his very slow, deliberate, shaky speaking and facial twitches that he is incredibly drunk. So in this production, and in Shakespeare's original text, it is clear that we are not intended to worry too much about what exactly may have happened to Elbow's wife. Instead, we are encouraged to have a breather from the strangely, disturbingly harsh sentencing of Claudio, and the slightly odd decision from the Duke to put Angelo in power and disguise himself as a friar. We know that we are watching a group of silly characters. one of whom is particularly fun and anarchic, as evidenced in this production by Pompey's cheeky thrust while saying the word come, making it abundantly clear that we are talking about sex. Our role is simply to sit back and laugh at the silliness. Act 2 Scene 3 is also worth a look, given the directorial decision to have Juliet not just obviously pregnant, but on the very verge of giving birth. She's been plonked into a wheelchair for this interrogation by the friar, is sweating and breathing heavily, and even seems to be starting to get contractions. This is clearly not the time for repeated questioning or lecturing, or indeed abrupt insensitivity, seen here in the Duke's revelation that Claudio is going to die the very next day. So the presentation of Juliet on the verge of giving birth reflects badly on both Angelo and the Duke. We are reminded of Angelo's choice of Claudio as the person to make an example of, which seems particularly heartless in these circumstances. As for the Duke, we are unconvinced by his effectiveness as a supposed man of God, although it's worth pointing out that during Shakespeare's time, friars would have been viewed with suspicion and were frequently objects of mockery within contemporary productions, although not in this particular play. Within the chapter entitled Shakespeare's Duke in Disguise, Rosalind Miles explores Jacobean responses to friars on the stage. She points out that for an audience of 1604, real friars would have been at most a distant memory, and suggests that Shakespeare and other dramatists were drawing upon a purely literary tradition, which would typically consist of attacks on friars and mistrust of religious orders. Shakespeare may have been aware of the tradition of mocking friars, but ultimately he may have chosen this particular disguise as a neutral opportunity to give the Duke immediate access to Isabella and ensure immediate trust. Rosalind Miles again. It turns the Duke into the only kind of man to whom Isabella and Mariana would have paid any attention. Isabella could turn to no one but this holy man. Yet in this production and at this moment, we get the impression that this friar cum duke, this person, may not be someone you'd want to turn to in a moment of crisis. If he doesn't have the emotional nous to realise that unleashing insensitive bombshells about partners dying the next day, or hectoring someone having contractions may not be such a good idea, then why would you let him loose on any other vulnerable women? Now for a particularly fascinating moment involving Angelo in Act 2 Scene 4. Alone on stage for his opening soliloquy, he slowly takes down his trousers to reveal a cilice consisting of a spiked chain. This practice is used by certain members of Opus Dei, a religious sect founded in 1928, in order to, in the words of Sarah Cassidy, a senior female figure in Opus Dei, suppress desires and atone for sins. So what are we supposed to make of this revelation that Angelo indulges in Opus Dei-esque flesh and desire mortifying practices? Well, on the one hand, many of us are likely to think, what a weirdo. Yes, Lucio, Pompey and co. may seem to spend too much time talking, joking and participating in sex, but at least they are open about their desires and pastimes, and together they seem part of a broader community of fun-loving members. However, Angelo seems isolated from the rest of Vienna in his obsessive self-moderation, and this revelation that he secretly disfigures his inner thigh distances him further from the vibrant energy and normality of the rest of the city. That said, given the obvious successes in the city, some part of us may admire Angelo for his determination to suppress his inner urges and try not to get sucked into the maelstrom of sexual depravity. Though, might someone who uses spiked chains on their own flesh also end up being disturbingly sadomasochistic in the bedroom if ever tempted into a sexual encounter with another person? Might this revelation make us feel even more nervous for Isabella following Angelo's indecent proposal in the same scene? And Isabella's reaction in this production is also fascinating. Following Angelo's explicit indecent proposal and violent manhandling, she starts to shake and becomes frozen in position. Her eyes roll upwards and one hand stays on her mouth with the other impotently protective in front of her vagina. It takes her some time to recover from this spasm following Angelo's exit. So what do we make of this reaction? Well, it really emphasises how Isabella has closed herself off from all thoughts and ideas of sexual activity, hence her sudden and uncontrollable contractions. It is her body reacting to something utterly alien to her beliefs and experience. Ironically, though, these spasms may point to unnatural repression. After all, human contact and mutual sexual encounters are entirely natural parts of the human condition, and thus align her on one small level to her predator, the one who in this production aims to subdue his own desires for the use of that deliciously pain-providing, skin-ripping silice. Time now to think about how you might integrate a reference to the RSC 2019 production within an essay. This particular essay asks you to consider whether the play ends happily and whether it has a lot to say about death. The play certainly contains moments in which death seems strangely prominent, at least for the modern viewer. The Duke's speech to Claudio in Act 3, Scene 1 stands out for its staggeringly depressing personification of death, in which Claudio is branded Death's Fool and told that death unloads thee. The Duke is ostensibly there as a friar to prepare Claudio for death, but the fact that he does this by making life seem worthless and utterly depressing, rather than presenting a Christian New Testament perspective referencing the benevolence of God and the hope of heaven, seems odd. Another factor is that the audience know that the Duke potentially has the power to save Claudio's life. He would simply have to remove his disguise and inform Angelo that his tenure was over. In a similar way, in Act 2, Scene 4, Angelo seems to dwell on death more than is strictly necessary. He tells Isabella that if she refuses to yield up the body to my will, Claudio won't just die, but will be tortured, his death draw out to lingering sufferance. What we are seeing here is that men with power in Vienna are unscrupulously willing to reference death in order to intimidate and manipulate other people. However, referencing death is only one of a number of tactics employed, which on stage will also include physical intimidation. This is seen in the 2019 RSC production when Angelo grabs hold of Isabella to illustrate his determination to carry out his threat to draw out Claudio's death to lingering sufferance. Her body spasms in shock, which doesn't deter Angelo one jot. In a world in which men with power entirely dominate the women, any manoeuvre which will help the male achieve its goals may be employed.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, taking you through 4 different interpretations of Leisure for Measure and helping you get that ace.